Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. In this week's episode, I'm going to be unpacking some scholarship. In particular, I'm unpacking the paper titled Interested in Class But Not in the Hallway, a Latent Class Analysis, LCA, of 2015 to 16 CS4All Student Surveys. And this paper is written by Kenneth Graves and Latent DeLyser. And as always, you can find in the show notes a link directly to this paper, as well as links to the author Google Scholar profiles of any scholar's works that I unpack in this particular podcast. You can find them by clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on, or simply going to jaredoleary.com, and then clicking on the show notes for this particular episode. All right, so here's the abstract for this paper. Quote, computer science, CS, education initiatives often use measures of interest to assess outcomes. Although appropriate for initiatives meant to encourage future participation, these measures do not always align with the complex nature of interest as described by the learning sciences literature or recognize the reality that school-related initiatives aimed at student engagement in CS will not produce individual interests in every student. In this paper, we present a review of the interest literature and data from a survey with evidence of validity of over 1,500 students in various CS courses in New York City. By using Latent Class Analysis, LCA, we identify 5 different statistically significant subgroups of CS students. 1. Enthusiasts. 2. Engaged. 3. Bookish. 4. Idlers. And 5. Disinterested. Our findings suggest that while some students enjoy CS in class and feel their teacher is pedagogically effective, they may not develop the individual interests characterized by seeking additional learning opportunities outside of class. End quote. If I were to summarize this into a one-sentence summary, I would say that this paper highlights that although many of the 1,525 survey respondents expressed an interest in computer science in the classroom setting, they did not choose to engage in CS outside of the classroom. All right, so this paper was written in 2017, and at the time of the publication, they were saying that there's a lot of CS initiatives going on in K-12 education in the United States, and this is great, and we're integrating with content areas like math and science, etc., and the CS discourse is often quoting a large number of available jobs in the profession that require some CS or computing skills. However, the authors note that, quote, these initiatives have struggled to find common assessments or outcomes for all students, end quote. That's on page 243. In particular, the authors note that there are basically 2 different types of categories of assessments of CS implementations. So one is on content, and then the other is on attitudes. Now, in this paper, they're focusing specifically on attitudes of, quote, student self-report surveys of interest, engagement, teacher pedagogical effectiveness, and teacher expectations and rigor, end quote. On page 243. Okay, so the literature review section of this paper is broken down into 2 different sections. One is on the assessments of student attitudes, specifically in CS education, and then the other section is just on interest, research, in educational settings at large. Now, in the section on student attitudes in CS education, the authors note that there are very few studies that actually use validated assessments when looking at students' attitudes in computer science education. So here's a quote from page 244. Quote, although interest is often used as a singular descriptor for CS education outcomes, research shows that it is actually a complex state, impacted both by intrinsic values of students and contextual priming that can catch students' interest, end quote. So while students might be individually interested in something, they can also be situationally interested in something, depending on what kind of environment or context they are in. So for example, if a student comes into a computer science class and already knows about the value of using coding or computer science to create some awesome things, they might be intrinsically or individually interested in it. However, if they are mandated to be in a coding or CS class, and they realize that, oh, I can make games with this, they might be situationally interested in learning how to code or engage in computer science because they're already interested in games and they're put into this environment that kind of prompts this situational interest in coding or CS. So the authors suggest that in CS education, in the courses and curricula, we need to actually not only go for situational interest, but also trigger individual interest in the subject area. So they summarize an approach for this. It's a 4-phase model for developing that kind of interest. So the first phase is to develop some kind of a situational interest in it. So like I mentioned, if a student's really interested in games, you can start there and be like, cool, you're interested in games? Well, let's learn how to make one. Now, over time, this kind of initial situational interest may motivate kids to have sustained situational interest engaging in computer science. So you might have the initial hook that can then build into longer sustained engagement within the class that you're working on. So for example, if you start with gaming and then you have another unit that goes into something like storytelling, a student might continue that interest because they started with learning how to create video games with code, and then they're transferring that interest over into another context, so it kind of sustains their interest in it. Then the goal would be to not just have sustained situational interest, but make it so that students are individually interested or intrinsically interested in the class that you're working on. So how do you go from that initial hook and then get it so that a student wants to continue their learning when they leave the class? And that's kind of the big thing, the big question that I think most educators should try and think through when engaging in the classroom, is how can I get it so that kids are so interested in this subject area that they don't want to just learn the subject area to get a good grade, but they want to actually learn it to apply it and continue to learn in their own life. However, I say that with a caveat that not every subject is going to have that kind of impact on every single kid. So for example, for me, I was very much so interested in music and the arts when I was in school, and I really didn't care about most other subjects. Even if it was a fantastic educator and I enjoyed what I was doing, I didn't want to go home and learn it. But I did, however, want to go home and learn to make music. So although it's an ideal, I understand not everyone is going to be 100% as invested in computer science or coding as I am or you might be. But we can at least strive for that, or at least attempt to. And as an example from page 244 of this paper, the authors mentioned that going from that situational to individual interest and getting kids to want to continue learning outside of your classroom setting, it might be something as simple as joining a club on the topic. So if you have an after-school coding or CS club or makerspace or something, getting them into that, or even just like going home and working on Scratch at home just to create a project for fun outside of a school-based assignment or something. And if I could add like one suggestion in there, try and find ways to celebrate when students do that. Encourage that and let others know that, oh yeah, you can take this home. And the reason why I'm saying this is because whenever a kid would come in and be like, hey, look at this cool thing I made over the weekend, I would share it with the rest of the class, and some of the students would be like, wait, you mean we can work on Scratch at home? And I'd be like, yes, of course. If you're interested in learning how to keep coding, then why stop here? So even though it might sound obvious for us, it seriously happened in several of my classes where kids all of a sudden had this epiphany, that light bulb moment where they went, oh, I can actually continue my learning at home. So make it explicit. Now, the question that kind of guides this particular study itself is, quote, to what extent are there different types of NYC CS students who participated in CS4All during the 2015-2016 school year, end quote, on page 244. Now, this question gets at what I was kind of mentioning earlier. So we have a range of kids who are going to be coming into the CS or coding classes that you're working with, and they're all going to participate in different ways along this continuum of not interested to maybe situationally interested or sustained situational interest, or like all the way on the other end of the spectrum where it's complete intrinsic or individual interest. So with kids being along that continuum, we need to kind of think about different ways of participating and different types of attitudes or levels of interest in the classes that we work with, and how to work with all of them. And ideally try and promote further interest in the subject area. Okay, so a quick recap of the intro of this paper. So the authors are saying, hey, we need to, if we're going to have all these like CS initiatives and implementations and whatnot, we need to take a look into how are kids engaging with this in terms of their attitudes and interest in the classes that they are now being forced or electing to take. So now let's quickly get nerdy and look at the methods section. So they designed a survey that was sent out to 1,525 students. These students were in a variety of programs such as Bootstrap, ScriptEd, and the NYC Software Engineering program, as well as a couple of software engineering classes in high schools. So the survey that was sent out was kind of broken down into a few different categories or variables. So one main area was the perceived pedagogical effectiveness. The next section was the perceived rigor and expectations. then was student engagement, and then it was student interest. So each one of these main categories kind of has their own subcategories. So for example, in the student engagement section, the 3 subcategories were participation in class, participation outside class, and excited to be in CS. So if you want to take a look at the different variables that they were assessing, take a look at page 245. There's a table at the top. All right, so let's talk results here. So as was mentioned in the abstract, there were basically 5 subgroups that they labeled as 1, enthusiasts, 2, bookish, 3, engaged, 4, idlers, and 5, disinterested. So think of that kind of like as a continuum of levels of engagement, from enthusiasts, like super excited, to disinterested, like why am I even here? I don't want to take this class. Okay, so if we look at this continuum, on the positive side of things, in terms of amount of interest, we have the enthusiasts and the bookish students. And what's fascinating is the CS students who were labeled as enthusiasts made up 54.6% of the sampled students. So that means more than half of the students who responded to the survey were identified as being on the positive end of the spectrum and were enthusiastic about the CS classes that they were doing. And the reason why they were labeled that way is because, quote, these students have the highest proportion positive responses to questions about their experience learning CS, as well as the highest interest and engagement level inside and outside of the classroom, end quote. That's from page 246. Now, if we go to the other end of the spectrum, we have the disinterested students. And what was kind of nice to see is that number was very low, that percentage. So it was only 6.3% of students were marked as disinterested. So I want to read you a few sentences of findings on disinterested students from page 246, because I think this is really interesting for CS educators to hear. Quote, a low proportion of students in this group indicated that their teacher did motivating activities in the classroom, 7.9%, and made learning CS interesting, 7.7%. Disinterested CS students also had the lowest proportion of students who participated in CS-focused activities inside, 32.1%, and outside, 4.9%, the classroom. In addition, only 10.4% of disinterested CS students believed that they considered themselves as CS people, end quote. Okay, so let's talk about the other 3 different subcategories in here. So bookish students, again, this is on the high end of the spectrum, was 22.2% of the students who were surveyed, and 94.7% of them expressed a high interest in taking CS. 98.3% of them strived to do really well in their CS class, and 92.1% of them thought that CS could be useful for their future. And that 97.1% of them also saw themselves as CS people. However, only 45.9% felt that CS could be useful in everyday life, and only 35.4% of them thought that they actually engaged in CS activities outside of the classroom itself. So although the majority of bookish students were very engaged in class and very much so enjoyed it and thought that there was a future for them with CS, they still did not engage in it outside of the classroom setting. Now, the other 2 areas, the engaged and the idlers, engaged mostly felt that the classes were interesting and motivating, whereas the idlers less so. For example, the idlers had only 18% of respondents indicate that they actually felt CS was useful in everyday life, and only 21.1% actually expressed any interest in CS content. So on page 247, there's a chart at the top of the page that shows the 5 different subgroups of CS students. So using that chart, you can see how each subgroup responded, on average, to the different categories of questions that were asked. Now I want to close the discussion of these findings with a quote from page 247. Quote, the characteristics of these groups highlight the need for more granularity in our measurements and descriptions of interest as we measure CS education's impact on students, end quote. So this gets at one of my lingering questions and one of the problems that I have with surveys in particular. So surveys are great for sending out something to a lot of people, getting some general feedback, and getting some responses like these. Maybe even some open prompts or responses that can be put into codes or themes or categories like they did in this latent class analysis. My follow-up question that would be for each person who responded to this survey is why? Why did they mark it this way? Why did they mark that they were interested in the content but did not see an application outside of the class. So for example, why is it that some of the subgroups were very interested in the classroom setting, but they did not engage in computer science out of the classroom? This is like the big $1 million question that I think we honestly need to be asking of every kid that we work with. If students are in your class and they're very engaged with it, but they don't go home and work on it, why is that? Is it because they don't have access to devices or to the internet? Is it because they don't have time for it? Is it because they're interested in it, but they don't realize they can do it at home, like some of the kids that I've worked with? Could it be that all they're really interested in is getting a good grade and checking off whatever's on the rubric to get that good grade? And outside of that, they're just playing the game that is called school, and they really don't have any interest in the subject area that they're doing well in? Or perhaps it's some of the equity things that we've talked about in the other Unpacking Scholarship episodes, or even some of the interviews. Maybe they don't see themselves in CS because they don't see other people like them, or they don't know that they have a potential career in this. With or without degrees or education, they could go into this, but they just don't know that. Or maybe they're interested in a career in something else, and they don't realize that they can do CS for fun. One of the big things that I've talked about in particular in a lot of the interviews is, yeah, it's great that a lot of people want jobs, and there's plenty of CS jobs out there. But what about the people who just want to engage in CS for fun? Like all the Unpacking Scholarship episodes that I did on mod culture. Like, I proposed to my wife by modding the game Minecraft. Why did I do that? It had nothing to do with a job. I learned Java so I could get married. Perhaps there are students that are like that. They're like, you know what? I really want to become a doctor. I'm inspired by the medical professionals right now that are combating COVID, and that's what I want to do. And then you could go, cool. Did you know that you could analyze data using computer science techniques that you're learning now? Maybe that's their in, to realize that there are connections outside of this. But we won't know until we actually ask those follow-up questions of why. So if there's one thing that I can leave you with, it's just when you are back in the classroom with your kids, ask them why. Why are they interested, or why are they not interested? Don't just ask one end of the continuum. Seriously, ask everybody. You could even start off each quarter or something with that question. Why are you or are you not interested in computer science? If you're not interested in it, what are you passionate about and why? I hope you found this episode useful. Next week is going to be another interview, and 2 weeks from now will be another Unpacking Scholarship. As always, I just ask that you simply share this with somebody who might find this interesting and useful. I hope you're all staying safe. I hope you're all having a wonderful week, and I will talk to you next week.